Right now, as you're watching this, bombs are falling on Tehran. The United States and Israel just launched the largest joint military operation in modern history. Over 200 fighter jets, 500 targets. The Iranian supreme leader is reportedly dead, and Iran has already fired missiles back, hitting U.S. bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE. You're watching the news. You're seeing the explosions. But here's what nobody on TV is telling you. This war is going to cost you money. A lot of it. And not in the way you think. The anchors are talking about geopolitics. They're talking about nuclear programs and regime change. What they are not talking about is what this means for your gas tank on Monday morning, your grocery bill next month, your mortgage rate in 6 months, your retirement portfolio in a year. That is what this video is about. If you want to understand what's really about to happen to your wallet, your portfolio, your gas prices, and the entire American economy, stay right here. Because in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk you through every single mechanism that connects bombs in Tehran to your bank account in America. Hit subscribe right now, because the next 72 hours are going to move fast, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Let me ask you a question. You've heard of the Suez Canal, you've heard of the Panama Canal, but have you ever heard of the Strait of Hormuz? You should have, because 20 million barrels of oil pass through that narrow strip of water every single day. That's roughly 20% of all the liquid fuel that powers the entire planet. Cars, factories, airlines, heating systems. 1/5 of the world's oil. Through a waterway you could almost swim across, and Iran sits right on top of it. Iran has spent decades building what military analysts call an anti-access area denial strategy, specifically designed to close that strait the moment they feel existentially threatened. We're talking about hundreds of fast attack boats, shore-based anti-ship missiles, submarine mines, and a network of coastal batteries that can blanket the entire waterway within hours. This wasn't improvised. This was planned. This has been the contingency. And now, the trigger has been pulled. Right now, unverified reports suggest Iran has already announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. If that's confirmed, and I want to be clear, it is not yet confirmed, we are not talking about a geopolitical crisis. We are talking about the single most significant energy disruption since the 1973 oil embargo. Sound familiar? In 1973, Arab nations closed off oil exports to the United States for just 5 months. 5 months. Gas prices quadrupled. Lines stretched around the block. Nixon declared a national energy emergency. The U.S. stock market lost 45% of its value. Unemployment doubled. And the economy didn't fully recover for years. That was 4% of global supply. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20%. But here's what makes today different from 1973. Back then, America was heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Today, the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. We've got shale fields in Texas, North Dakota, and New Mexico pumping more oil than Saudi Arabia. You'd think that would protect us. It doesn't. And that's the part that should terrify you. Because oil is not priced by country. It is priced by the world. The moment global supply is threatened, the benchmark price rises for everyone, including Texas shale, including your gas station on the corner. The market doesn't care that your barrel came from Midland, Texas. If a barrel from Oman is suddenly worth $100, your barrel is worth $100 too. That's the trap. And we're walking right into it. Think about that. Here's what this means for you on Monday morning. Brent crude oil closed on Friday at $72.87 a barrel, before a single missile was fired. Analysts are now forecasting a jump to $80 a barrel at minimum when markets open Sunday night. If hostilities continue and the strait is disrupted, projections climb toward $100 a barrel. That number, $100, is not an abstraction. That's what you feel at the pump. U.S. average gasoline prices are currently sitting around $3 a gallon. Patrick DeHaan from GasBuddy, one of the most accurate fuel market trackers in the country, is already projecting prices rising to $3.10 to $3.15 per gallon in the coming weeks, just from initial shocks. And that's the best-case scenario.
In a prolonged conflict with the strait disrupted, we are talking $4, $5, possibly higher. And before you tell me that happened before and we survived, yes, we did. But not without pain. When gas spiked above $4 in 2022, American households spent an average of $2,000 more on fuel than the year before. That $2,000 didn't come from nowhere. It came from savings, from discretionary spending, from restaurant trips that didn't happen, vacations that got canceled, holiday gifts that got scaled back. Entire retail sectors shrank because consumers were financially exhausted before they walked through the door. You don't escape this just because you live in Texas. But here's what most people miss. It's not just gasoline. Everything you buy at the grocery store, every box, every bottle, every piece of meat, arrived on a truck. That truck runs on diesel. That diesel is about to get more expensive. So is the cost of farming equipment, agricultural chemicals, and the refrigeration systems that keep food from rotting before it reaches the shelf. The American Trucking Association estimates that fuel costs account for roughly 24% of the total operating cost of a trucking fleet. When diesel prices climb, that cost gets passed down the chain, to the distributor, then to the retailer, then to you. Quietly, invisibly, in the form of a box of cereal that used to be $4.99 and is now $5.79. You call it expensive. They call it a supply chain adjustment. Inflation, coming back, hard. The Federal Reserve spent 3 years fighting inflation. Interest rates went from near zero to over 5%. They only just started cutting. Jerome Powell has been cautious, deliberate, watching every data point before moving. And now, a war in the Middle East threatens to undo all of that work in a matter of weeks. Not because the Fed made a mistake, because war doesn't care about monetary policy. You might be thinking, okay, but the market always bounces back. I know that's what you're thinking, because that's what happened every other time there was a Middle East flare-up. April 2024, October 2024, June 2025, when the US first struck Iranian nuclear sites. Each time, markets sold off at the open, then recovered once it became clear the Strait of Hormuz remained open. That is the pattern every analyst on Wall Street is referencing right now. But this time is different. This isn't a contained strike on a nuclear facility. This is a full-scale, multi-day military campaign aimed at regime change. The US military is planning for weeks of operations, not hours. Iranian leadership has been decimated. The regime is retaliating against 6 countries simultaneously, and oil tanker companies, not just speculators, actual tanker companies, have already suspended shipments through the strait. The Dow Jones dropped 1.3% last week on rumors of a possible attack. The S&P 500 lost 0.4%. The Nasdaq dropped nearly 1%. And that was before a single bomb fell. Monday open is going to be violent. Equity markets globally are expected to open down 1 to 2% at minimum. If conflict deepens, David Roach of Quantum Strategy, one of the sharpest macro analysts in the business, warns that markets could react rather badly, with a broader sell-off across risk assets. Here's what that means in plain English. If the S&P 500 opens down 2% and continues falling, and you have a $200,000 retirement account, you just lost $4,000 before breakfast, before you've even checked your phone, before you've had your first cup of coffee. Your account went down by $4,000 because of a war you didn't vote for, didn't plan for, and weren't warned about by a single financial news anchor last week. That's the reality of living inside a globally connected economy. Flight to safety assets are going to explode. Gold is already up 22% in 2026, and it's about to go higher. US Treasuries are going to surge. The dollar will strengthen against most emerging market currencies. And Bitcoin, which many thought had become a safe haven, dropped 2% on Saturday and is down over 25% in 2 months. In a crisis, people don't reach for speculative assets. They reach for certainty. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, are you watching this from the US or somewhere else? Because what I'm about to show you hits differently depending on where you live. Drop your location below. I read every single one. The people who understand this are already repositioning. The question is, are you? Now here's the part nobody is talking about. You've heard about oil prices, you've heard about the stock market, but there's a deeper, slower, more dangerous cost to this war, and it's going to hit the American middle class in ways that won't show up on your brokerage app. War is expensive, The US is already carrying $36 trillion in national debt. Interest payments on that debt now exceed what America spends on its entire military in peacetime. The F-35 sorties, the carrier strike groups, the precision munitions, the logistical chain that keeps a modern air campaign running, none of that is free. The Iraq War cost an estimated $2 trillion over 20 years. The Afghanistan War cost over $2.3 trillion. And those were ground wars with boots in the sand. A high-tempo air campaign involving 2 carrier strike groups, hundreds of cruise missiles, and potential naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz? That is not a cheap weekend. Every dollar spent on operations in Iran gets added to a credit card that's already maxed out. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is inflation combined with debt. Here's how the trap works. Higher oil prices mean higher inflation. Higher inflation means the Fed may have to pause, or even reverse, the interest rate cuts that were supposed to save the housing market, lower mortgage rates, and reduce the cost of corporate borrowing. If inflation reaccelerates, rates stay high. High rates mean the US government pays more interest on that $36 trillion. More interest means more borrowing. More borrowing means more money eventually printed. More money printed means your purchasing power quietly, invisibly, shrinks. Economists have a name for this feedback loop. They call it fiscal dominance. It's the moment when war spending and debt service start to override the Fed's ability to control the economy. It happened in the 1970s. Vietnam War spending plus the oil embargo created the stagflation that crushed an entire generation of Americans. It took Paul Volcker hiking rates to 20% to break it. 20%. Your mortgage would have been 20%. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is economic history. And the conditions that created it are present again today, only with a national debt 5 times larger than it was in 1979. You're not a passenger in this system. You are the one paying for it. Here's the dimension that most financial commentators are completely missing. This isn't just an American problem. And that's exactly why it becomes an even bigger American problem. Japan imports 90% of its energy. South Korea imports 80%. Germany, France, Italy, all major US trading partners, are heavily dependent on Persian Gulf oil. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, these economies don't just feel pain, they seize up. Manufacturing slows, export orders drop. The European Central Bank will be forced into emergency mode. The Bank of Japan, already in a fragile position after decades of ultra-low interest rate policy, faces a crisis it has no clean tools to fight. Why does that matter to you? Because the United States doesn't operate in a vacuum. When Europe goes into recession, demand for American exports drops. American companies, from Boeing to Caterpillar to Apple, start missing revenue targets. When Japan's economy shakes, global financial markets tremble because Japan holds over $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds. If Japanese investors need to sell treasuries to raise cash domestically, US interest rates rise. And rising US interest rates mean higher mortgage costs, higher auto loan costs, and higher credit card rates for you. A war in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It travels through oil pipelines, shipping lanes, currency markets, and bond yields until it lands right in your living room. China is watching all of this very carefully. China imports 45% of its oil from the Persian Gulf. A disrupted Strait of Hormuz is an existential economic threat to Beijing. This creates a volatile wild card. Does China intervene diplomatically? Does it pressure Iran to stand down? Or does it see an opportunity, with US military assets tied up in the Persian Gulf, to accelerate moves elsewhere in the Pacific? These are not fringe questions. These are the questions that intelligence agencies and treasury departments around the world are working through right now, tonight, in real time. The world got more complicated today, and complexity in financial markets always has a cost. Let me be real with you. Not everything here is catastrophic. There are two possible futures playing out right now, and you need to understand both. Scenario A, the short war. Iran's leadership is severely degraded. The regime collapses or sues for peace within 2 to 3 weeks. The Strait of Hormuz is never formally closed, or is closed briefly before U.S. naval forces reopen it. Oil spikes to $80, maybe $85, then retreats. Markets sell off 3 to 5%, then recover over 60 to 90 days. Inflation ticks up modestly. The Fed pauses rate cuts but doesn't reverse. The U.S. economy absorbs the shock and moves on. Wall Street books it as a volatility event, not a structural shift. History favors this scenario. Every Middle East crisis in the past decade has resolved faster than the worst predictions.
Scenario B, the long war. Iran's remaining factions regroup. Hezbollah opens a second front from Lebanon. Houthi attacks intensify across the entire Red Sea corridor. Oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia or the UAE gets struck, either by Iranian proxies or by drones launched from what remains of the IRGC. The strait remains disrupted for weeks. Oil hits $100 a barrel. Inflation surges back above 5%. The Fed freezes. Mortgage rates spike back above 7%. The housing market, which was just starting to breathe again, collapses a second time. Recession risk climbs sharply. Corporate earnings collapse in Q2. Layoffs follow. In scenario B, the families who locked in low mortgage rates in 2020 and 2021 survive. Everyone else gets squeezed from 3 directions simultaneously: higher energy costs, higher borrowing costs, and falling asset values. The answer is, nobody knows yet which scenario this becomes. What I can tell you is that the next 72 hours are the most important window. If markets open Sunday night and the strait is still open, watch for a sharp but manageable move. If the strait is formally closed, or if Iran strikes Gulf oil infrastructure, we are in scenario B territory, and the playbook changes completely. Watch the tankers, not the news anchors. The tankers will tell you the truth first. Here's the bottom line. Today, February 28, 2026, is a line in the sand. Before today, the Middle East was a risk factor that markets priced in and largely ignored. After today, the Middle East is an active war zone involving American troops, American money, American aircraft carriers, and American consequences. The average person watching the news right now sees explosions and political drama. They see it the same way they watch a weather forecast for a city they don't live in. Interesting, concerning, not their problem. That is the most expensive mistake they can make, because this war is going to transmit into your economy whether you pay attention or not. The only difference is whether you see it coming. You have 4 things to watch in the next 48 hours. 1. Does the Strait of Hormuz remain open? If yes, contained shock. If no, paradigm shift. 2. Does Hezbollah enter the conflict from Lebanon? A second front dramatically escalates the timeline and the cost. 3. How does Monday's market open react? Asian exchanges open Sunday evening. That will be your first real signal. Watch the Nikkei. Watch the Hang Seng. They open before New York wakes up. 4. What does the Fed say? If Jerome Powell speaks before Wednesday, that alone is a market-moving event. Watch for emergency language. Watch for the word monitor. That word, monitor, is Fed speak for, we're scared but we're not ready to admit it yet. The people who understand how wars transmit into economies, into oil prices, into inflation, into debt spirals, into your grocery bill and your mortgage and your retirement account, are the people who don't get caught flat-footed. You're not uniquely bad at this. Most people are just now finding out a war started. They don't know what it means for their wallet. They don't know about the Strait of Hormuz. They don't know about fiscal dominance. They don't know about the 1973 playbook. Now you do. And that puts you ahead of almost everyone else watching the news tonight. If this gave you a framework for what's actually happening, not just the explosions, but the economics behind them, drop a comment below. Tell me, are you repositioning? Are you staying put? Are you buying gold? Moving to cash? Or is this just noise to you? And if you're watching from outside the US, tell me where you are and what time it is for you right now. I want to know how far this conversation is reaching. Subscribe for the follow-up. In the next video, we go deeper. What happens to the US dollar if this war drags into summer, and what that means for every single thing you own? It's a story nobody wants to tell, but you need to hear it.